Welcome to Lost in Transmission, Episode 3. We're diving into the New Testament text, the physical evidence itself, and some of the attributes. So we're starting with the New Testament text prior to AD 100. So as we've been saying all along, there are no originals, no autographs, as they're also known as. And the oldest extant manuscript is P52. It's a fragment from the Gospel of John. It's dated to the early 2nd century. And so it's possibly only 50 to 75 years after the book was written. And autographs were either written by their authors or dictated to scribes or secretaries. And you see Romans 16:22 and 2 Thessalonians 3:17 mention these secretaries. And once the letters were written, they were delivered to their respective churches by friends or travelers going to that destination. And so for example, one of Paul's friends and faithful brother, Tychicus, delivered his letters to Ephesians, and that's mentioned in Ephesians 6:21 and 22, and to the Colossians, Colossians 4:7 through 9, and possibly to Titus, Titus 3:12. And then Paul often encouraged the recipients of his letter to circulate them among other churches. Colossians 4:16 makes a reference to that. And thus the autographs would at times have been copied almost immediately or sent off to other churches. And so it's unlikely that a professional scribe would have been hired to copy these letters, since the cost generally would have been prohibitive. But most likely someone from the various recipient churches would copy the autographs and send them on to the next church. The earliest manuscripts were called unsealed script, and that means like capital letters, all capitals, and on papyrus. It's not until the 3rd century or so that they started upgrading the material to parchment or vellum. And so then short books would be written on a single piece of papyrus, and then scrolls were used for the longer books. Gospels originally circulated orally, and then they were inscripturated, but letters were immediately written and then sent. Let's read this paragraph to get sort of an overview of the New Testament text. In some senses, the history of the transmission of the New Testament manuscripts is significantly different than the Old Testament, since it was influenced by the history of the early Christian church. The early church was persecuted for much of its history, and thus the transmission of the New Testament text often lacked much of the care and precision that the Old Testament received. Still, the early church held the New Testament text with the same reverence and authorship as the Old Testament, and cited as 2 Peter 3:15 and 16. An examination of the history of the transmission of the New Testament would provide a foundation for our study in New Testament textual criticism. So again, there's no originals, but several papyrus fragments date to the 2nd century. So P32, P46, P52, P64, P66, and so on. And we'd mentioned P52 as the oldest. So let's read this comment by Bruce Metzger with regards to Paul encouraging recipients of his letters to circulate them among the churches. So Bruce Metzger explains, in the early years of the Christian church, marked by rapid expansion and consequent increased demand by individuals and by congregations for copies of the scriptures, the speedy multiplication of copies, even by non-professional scribes, sometimes took precedence over strict accuracy of detail. This may explain the large number of New Testament manuscripts and why there are generally more mistakes in the New Testament manuscripts than in the copies of the Old Testament. Most, if not all, of the New Testament books were completed by AD 100, after which began the copying process. So let's put this in context a bit, since you can be given the impression that the modern critics today of the New Testament would like to think that the people of that day were as careless as people are today. That game they play where you you get 10 or 20 people in a theater or something, and you give them a message and you whisper it to the next person, then to the next, and to the next, and to the next. And then the last person tells what the message is, and it's totally different from what the original was. Well, ancient people weren't like that. They were much more dependent on oral tradition. And so they were a lot more diligent with listening. Their listening skills were much better, and their memorization skills were much better. For example, the Pharisees, like St. Paul, would probably have the entire first books of the Bible memorized, the Torah. And so we don't have that today. And so it's not fair to make that comparison. Today we are totally dependent on the written word. There's very little oral. In fact, there's a phenomenon today about people not having a memory because they just get used to picking up their phone and Googling, and so they don't retain anything. It's just when they want to know something, they have information at their fingertips, and so they don't use their memory. They don't commit things to memory. So it's not a fair comparison at all. And so while it's true, there are a lot of variants and a lot of mistakes. It wouldn't be fair to characterize it in the context of like that phone tag metaphor that's used by modern day critics of the Bible and New Testament. Now we'll discuss the New Testament text after AD 100. So a new form, a codex, which is like a modern book. It's bound on the left-hand side, and it's written on both sides. And there's some of the famous codexes are Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, two of the most famous. So many of the manuscripts were lost to persecution, Nero and Diocletian and so on. However, this all changed with the Edict of Milan, put forth by Constantine, Emperor Constantine, who made Christianity a legal, illicit religion. And so as this Edict of Milan marks a time of growth, and so there's more copies needed. And from the 4th century on, it was the task of monks to study and make copies of the New Testament. So this new era, after AD 100, more styles are being introduced into the text. So the unseal, including the unseal, the all capital, but then cursive and minuscule, which are lowercase type styles. So unsealed script was commonly used between the 1st and about 6th century. So it stuck around for a long time, though. And it did continue into the 10th or 11th century even. And so for centuries, though, these all capital texts were written with no breaks between words. And so this would lead to common mistakes, and I'll show you one. So this word here, alois etoi mastai, which means in English, but it is for those whom it has been prepared. Or less likely, alois etoi mastai, but it is for others whom it has been prepared. So then the chosen selection will read it in English here. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, and here it is, but is for those for whom it has been prepared. And that's this first variant here. So those are some of the confusions with not having a break. In the letters, you'd have to sort of have knowledge of the oral tradition for these inscripturated versions without line breaks to work, which is interesting. And so these very well-regarded manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Codex Alexandrinus, do not have divisions between words, but by the 6th century, and possibly because of the use of cursive writing, divisions began to appear between the words. So only about 100 early unsealed papyrus have survived. So we only have about 100 extant unsealed papyrus. And then cursive was used from the 3rd to the 9th century, and it was written more quickly. Let's say that unseal is like printing, and cursive is like longhand when we write in longhand. And minuscule is similar to cursive, but only it's smaller. At present, there are about 2,754 New Testament minuscule manuscripts. That's more than half of the manuscripts are in the minuscule form. As we'd mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, one of the problems in the text with confusing letters, like a capital O with a capital theta, capital Omicron with a capital theta. And the example that we saw was an abbreviation of theos with just the theta and sigma. And so what they did was to cut down on some of the verbosity of the writing. They came up with systems of abbreviations for common words, and that started about 200 AD. So let's take a look at these abbreviations. So across the head here we have Greek words, what they mean in English, nominative abbreviation. Nominative means in the subject position. Genitive abbreviation. Genitive means in the possessive case. Nominative case, genitive possessive case. So this is theos, means God. And so the abbreviation is capital theta, capital sigma in unseals, and then in cursive or minuscule scripts, it's just small case theta and sigma. And then in the genitive, it's theta and upsilon. And so I'm not going to go over the unseal and cursive and minuscule each time. We'll just go over we'll just say what the letters are and not make a distinction between whether they're capital or not. Then the next word is kurios, which means Lord, and it's capital kappa, it's kappa and sigma. Jesus, and there's no J in Greek, so it's this Jesus, means Jesus, and it's iota and sigma. Christ is Christos, and this chi and sigma. Huios, and you get the H sound with this breathing mark when it's curved this way. It's like you put an H in front of it. There's no H in Greek. Huios means son, and so it's a upsilon and a sigma. Pneuma means spirit. So you have a P. This pi shape is called P, like in English we say P. So it is P and alpha. David is delta, and they have 3 letters: delta, alpha, and delta. Stauros means cross. Sigma, tau, sigma. Mater means mother. Mu, eta, and P, and rho. This P is not a P, it's a R, actually. In Greek, the P is actually an R. Rho looks like a P in English. Pater is P and rho, means father. Israel, Israel, and it's iota, eta, lambda. Soter means salvation, and that's sigma, eta, and rho. Anthropos means man. It's alpha, nu, omicron, sigma. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, iota, alpha, eta, mu. And then Uranos means heaven. It's omicron, upsilon, nu, omicron, sigma. So generally the abbreviations include the first and last letter of the word, and the latter is necessary to indicate the declension or part of speech of the word. So like I'd mentioned, there's all of the genitives end in an upsilon, which is a genitive form. Few, if any, punctuation marks were added to the earliest manuscripts, but more were added by scribes during the 6th and 7th century. Verse divisions were a very late development. In fact, the first English Bible to contain verse divisions was the Geneva Bible. Parchment and leather were sometimes cleaned and rescraped for reuse, which resulted in a manuscript called a palimpsest, from two Greek words, palin, again, and psau, to scrape. About 20% of the extant new manuscripts are these types. Codex Ephraemi is a 5th century New Testament manuscript that was erased and reused in the 12th century for 38 sermons or treatises by Ephraim, the 4th century Syrian church father. In time, the church developed a lectionary system for both Old and New Testament that enabled the entire Bible to be read in the course of several years. At first, notations were made in later unsealed manuscripts, all capital, that indicate the order in which the text would be read, beginning with Easter and continuing throughout the year. Later, presumably for the convenience of readers who most likely did not own their own Bible, lectionaries included the text of the biblical passage to be read during worship service. The earliest extant lectionaries come from about the 10th century and have become another source for determining the most accurate readings of the New Testament. So lectionaries are fall into the witness category. Okay, now let's get into the transmission process. So scholars tell us that every manuscript, textual tradition, or text form contains evidence of corruption. So the greater quantity of later manuscripts discovered than early ones due to the perishable nature. So you're going to find more of the later copies, right, than you're going to find early. That's all they're saying, of course. And then some late manuscripts may be copies of much earlier. Okay, that's almost self-evident. The transmission process is certainly more complicated than is often thought. New Testament manuscripts were likely taken from one place to another. Some were destroyed in wars, others were hidden. Some may have been corrected by copyists who compared them to other manuscripts, and they were copied over a long period of time. Gordon Fee, who's a biblical scholar, describes the early period of textual transmission as follows. Much of the difficulty stems from the work of the early Christian copyists. In a time when the majority of people were illiterate, and when Christianity periodically underwent severe persecution, there are probably few professionally trained scribes in the service of the church. Moreover, seldom were the scribes possessed by the spirit of the scribes of later times who worked according to the instructions of the Lord given in Deuteronomy 12:32. Thou shalt not add thereto nor diminish therefrom. In fact, the opposite seems to be true of the scribes in the first 2 centuries. That's a citation by Gordon Fee. As scribes inadvertently and sometimes intentionally introduce errors into their copies, a ripple effect would result. Copies of their copies would pass on these errors as well as new ones. Unless these manuscripts were compared with others and corrected, mistakes would be retained. In principle, manuscripts can be compared and arranged into textual clusters based on similarities of mistakes. While not all scholars agree with this general description of the transmission process, Michael Holmes encapsulates the following foundational principles that are generally accepted. And Michael Holmes is author of A Case for Reasoned Eclecticism, which is, by the way, the technique that has been used since the 20th century. It's the prevailing technique, and it's being used now in the with the coherence-based genealogical method as well. So that is the state of the art. Anyway, so Holmes encapsulates the following foundational principles that are generally accepted. Number 1, every manuscript's textual tradition or text form contains evidence of corruption. The various manuscripts demonstrate a progression from a rather undisciplined or less accurate copying process from the latter 1st and 2nd centuries to more disciplined and stable textual traditions in the 5th century. There's little evidence to suggest intentional recension activity. In other words, a scribe intentionally alters the text to make it correspond more closely to his or her own views. But most variants, in manuscripts appear to be the result of unintentional mistakes or scribes who intentionally attempted to correct, in quotes, an error, a text. 2. It is reasonable to assume that a greater quantity of later manuscripts will be discovered than earlier ones due to the perishability of written materials, the number of manuscripts made, and possibility of their destruction. For example, Tischendorf found monks burning old manuscripts to keep themselves warm during one of his visits to the St. Catherine's Monastery, where he found Codex Sinaiticus, by the way. Thus, the transmission process has been shaped by external circumstances such as war, persecution, rise of Islam, politics of the Byzantine Empire. 3. Some late manuscripts may be a copy of much earlier manuscripts, i.e. a later copyist may have had access to an early manuscript. It appears possible to reconstruct at least some stages of transmission process. For example, Family 1 and Family 13 demonstrate significant textual similarities. This helps us to understand the broader picture of the transmission of the text. So the wording in that paragraph may not seem so clear. I think all that he's saying here is that copyists had access to manuscripts that we don't have access to, or someone later didn't have access to. And so you can start building a lineage based on that. And I think it would depend on the copyist too. So, but what Holmes is saying here is that sometimes cross-contamination was a result of seemingly random events also. So this next point about cross-contamination, he's saying, for example, an influential church leader like St. John Chrysostom supplies, or someone in a centrally located and or better supplied scriptorium, like in Constantinople, chooses perhaps for reasons having nothing to do with the textual character, okay? It might make a choice because it's greater legibility, or they like the layout or the format or the arrangement of the text, or simply because it's handy. And so a manuscript, a copyist may choose a manuscript for not the best reason, is what he's saying here. A manuscript as an exemplar from which to make new copies and a standard against which to correct existing ones. And as a result, the Bibles in use in the areas influenced by that leader or scriptorium begin to reflect the textual character of that selected model. So yeah, some great leader might be lazy and just likes the format, or it's easier to copy because he can read it easier, and not pick the text that, not use textual criticism to choose the better text for textual criticism reasons, instead for more handy reasons, which is a little sloppy. Transmission process then was not always consistent, nor did it necessarily follow well-defined principles. So Bart Ehrman, more recently, by the way, let's talk about Bart Ehrman. So Bart Ehrman is somewhat notorious in Orthodox Christian circles for some of his controversial books, like Jesus Misquoted and so on, which are sort of scathing criticisms of what we have in the New Testament. And basically saying that no one's read the New Testament. All we have is copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and there's, 1.5 million variants and blah, blah, blah. And the data he is stating is true, but his conclusion that the text hasn't been reliably transmitted, at least in his popular books, can be questioned. And by the way, if you read his more scholarly works, I think he does admit that the New Testament's been reliably transmitted, but hasn't been infallibly transmitted. I don't think we could claim that. So Bart Ehrman, by the way, who is he? He was Bruce Metzger's protege, star student. Bart Ehrman is brilliant, and Bruce Metzger's passed away, but Bart Ehrman is still alive. Now, I don't know how much he is up on the newest techniques like the coherence-based genealogical method, but at least in the 20th century, Bart Ehrman stood only second to Bruce Metzger. So he is definitely the most renowned New Testament scholar that's still alive in terms of experience and status. And so he's someone that you just can't dismiss. So Bart Ehrman has suggested that the New Testament may have been established by the interaction of several competing groups of early Christians that had different beliefs, such as the Ebionites, the Marcionites. But from early church history, we were able to see that early Christians fended off those who held heretical beliefs and were able to maintain the text of the New Testament. As far as we know, Marcion and those who held different canons or texts were offshoots and did not represent mainstream Christianity. This situation can be compared to Jewish scribes who maintained the Proto-Masoretic text against competing versions of the Old Testament in the 1st century AD. So that's kind of a controversial statement that the author of this book we're reading, Paul Wagner, is making. I think that the contemporary world would believe Bart Ehrman that that orthodoxy won, in that orthodoxy may not be orthodoxy as described today, and that won in the battle in history may not be the teachings of Christ or the teaching of the original New Testament, given that we cannot really prove that the extant copies we have go all the way back to those times, and there's the 50 to 70 year gap that people like Ehrman are suggesting we could have totally lost the transmission, and that what we have today is nothing like we have. It's like the quest for the historical Jesus. This has been going on for a long time, starting with Albert Schweitzer, and then more recently, like the Jesus Seminar and people like that, where scholars today are saying that the Jesus of history can't be reconciled with the Jesus of faith. And so that's one of the premises here that I'm trying to make, is that given the restrictions given science, the science of textual criticism cannot validate that the New Testament's been divinely preserved. We can believe it through faith, and that it's been handed on by faithful apostles and church fathers and so on. That's what I believe. But we cannot prove it using the science of textual criticism. Anyway, so we're bumping up against our half-hour limit, and so we're going to go ahead and stop here. And in our next lesson, or the next episode, we're going to be covering, talking about the history of New Testament textual criticism. Take a look at some of the historical figures that practice this discipline. And so, until the next episode, thanks for your attention.